Welcome to today's program titled Navigating FAR Compliance, Sustainable Sourcing Strategies. All participants are in listen-only mode. However, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit, a code will be read later in the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be repeated and is required for the CLE credit request form. During the presentation, you will also see a slide containing a QR code that can be scanned to access and submit your request for CLE credit. Copies of the program's recording and materials will be distributed to all attendees in the days ahead. At this time, I would like to turn the program over to Teddy Arnold. Teddy, you may begin.
Thanks, Eddie. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Teddy Arnold. I'm a partner in the Seyfarth Shaw Government Contracts Practice Group. With me are my fabulous colleagues, Gina Ferrari, a partner in our litigation group in San Francisco, and Amina Majid, our firm's impact and sustainability partner in Chicago. We're delighted that you're joining us for what is part 2 of our 30-minute micro webinar series called Winning Combinations, where we team up, the government contracts group teams up with other practice groups to discuss legal issues for government contractors that cross over into other areas. And so our thought is, if your legal issue doesn't fit squarely into one practice group, the content we provide shouldn't either. And so before we jump in, I'll give you a quick plug for the upcoming topics. All 30 minutes, not designed to destroy your lunch hour, so quick survey level issue spotting type things. Next month, we're doing mergers and acquisitions. And then in December, we're doing a webinar covering labor issues. So the agenda, if you go to the next slide, the agenda today, in the brief time we have, we're going to cover the regulatory landscape. That is all the action taking place with executive orders and with agency rulemaking vis-a-vis the FAR. We're also then going to look at the intersection of procurement regulations with the ESG landscape. And then we'll try and wrap it up and give you some key takeaways. And so the goal really is to give you a comprehensive understanding of the rules pertaining to sustainable procurement, an overview of ESG, how this impacts your business, what you can do to better position yourselves, to align with the government's objectives and regulatory requirements. So you can go to slide 1. Let's get into it. And the next slide. So what is sustainable procurement? It is otherwise the practice of acquiring goods and services in a way that considers their environmental, social, and economic impacts. And this approach is considered to not only focus on the immediate costs, but also to evaluate the long-term benefits to both society and the planet. And so within that framework, you've got these sort of 3 dimensions that often get paired together when you hear the word sustainable procurement. That's environmental, so it's the minimizing ecological harm. This is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and waste. And we'll talk about that in particular because there's a new rule, a proposed rule sitting on the books on that. The social dimension, which looks at ethical sourcing and fair labor practices. And then finally, you've got the economic dimension that looks at sort of the cost effectiveness of sustainable products over their entire life cycle. And together, these dimensions create this holistic approach to procurement that benefits all stakeholders. So if you go to the next slide, what are the benefits in case they aren't obvious? So you've got cost savings through energy efficient products and reduced waste. You've got mitigation of risk that are associated with regulatory compliance. You've got reputational issues, so it can either be enhanced reputation or reputational damage. And then you've just got the idea that you've got a competitive edge in a regulatory environment that is increasingly looking at procuring sustainable products and services. And as a backstop, I think we all agree it's the right thing to do, which is always a good reason. And so next slide, please. So when we talk about the regulatory landscape, this is rapidly evolving as we speak with new regulations and policy guidance that are both in place and on the horizon. When it comes to government regulation, you've got various sources of authority. Of course, Congress can legislate, but sort of one level down from that, you've got executive orders issued by the president. You've got agency rulemaking that happens within each of the agencies. So executive orders, you're probably familiar with these declarations made by the president based on the president's constitutional authority. and essentially directs agencies to do something or to refrain from doing something. Meanwhile, the FAR, this is the primary regulation governing the procurement process for federal agencies and establishes policies and procedures. And the FAR really is at the forefront. So the FAR Council, who sort of updates the FAR and implements regulations, is at the forefront of this transformation, developing regulations that incorporate climate-related financial risk and other types of considerations into federal procurements. And so these changes aren't just about compliance for the sake of compliance. They're about leveraging purchasing power to drive positive environmental outcomes. If you go to the next slide, since taking office, President Biden has issued a number of executive orders that are oriented towards sustainability. Many of these all happen, well, the ones on the screen here all happened in 2021, and it seems like they're still rolling out. But these sort of were setting the policy of his administration with regards to environmental procurement. You had tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. This established climate considerations. It aimed to enhance global climate action and cooperation, which included rejoining the Paris Agreement, which the US did. It set forth the goal of achieving a net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050 and to decarbonize the grid, as they say, by 2035. Some of these goals that you probably heard of in the public domain. Then there was an EO on climate-related financial risk. This recognizes risks from climate change, including extreme weather and the shift away from carbon-intensive energy sources, and essentially directed agencies to lead by example in managing these climate risks and prioritize sustainable investments. And then you've got the last one, catalyzing clean energy. This had some other goals, such as 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2030, zero emission vehicle acquisition, and net zero emissions in federal buildings. And then, of course, emissions reduction targets. And you've probably heard of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions that are then sitting on the books in the form of a proposed rule that we'll review in a few minutes here. So if you go to the next slide. So the relevant portion of the FAR is in Part 23, which is newly named Environment, Sustainable Acquisition, and Material Safety. And this outlines essentially the federal government's policies on sustainable procurement and mandates that agencies, the FAR speaks to regulations that govern how agencies conduct procurements, not contractors. We'll talk about how that works in a minute, but what the FAR tells agencies is that how they need to be procuring sustainable products and services to the maximum extent practicable. And we'll talk about that language too in a minute in the context of a newly issued regulation or newly issued rule. Additionally, the FAR emphasizes the importance of life cycle costs, and a lot of this isn't terribly new. The FAR has been incorporating these sustainable concepts for quite some time, dating back to at least 2002, where it was pushing guidance for energy efficiency and water conservation, as well as a rule that 95% of new contract actions should be for products that are energy efficient and water efficient, bio-based, environmentally preferable, things like that, non-ozone, recovered materials, all of the sort of the concepts that are still out there today. Part 23 also discusses hazardous materials management, market development, and of course, it's got a section on compliance and reporting, which is agencies reporting on their sustainable procurement practices and progress towards meeting their goals. If you go to the next slide. So in 2022, and this is still sitting out there, has not been, no movement has happened on it, but a proposed rule was issued by the FAR Council on greenhouse gas emissions. And you may have heard about this one, but this keyed off of an executive order that we just talked about, which essentially directed agencies to be considering greenhouse gas emissions when making procurement decisions. And so the FAR Council issued this proposed rule. It creates two categories of contractors. You've got significant contractors and those based on the dollar amounts of contract obligations in the prior fiscal year. So that's 7.5 to 50 million. And then above 50 million, you are considered a major contractor. And the obligations imposed by the proposed rule depend on whether you fit into the significant or major contractor category. Both categories have to perform annual greenhouse gas emission inventories. of what's called Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and disclose them on their sam.gov registrations. And we'll discuss the scopes here in a second. If you're a major contractor, so if you're getting big dollar contracts, you have to comply with additional requirements, annual climate disclosures, and then you've got to post that on your publicly available website. And you also have to develop what's called science-based targets that provide the contractor with a pathway for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it's fairly specific, but these targets, essentially you develop them, they've got to be validated by what's called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And there's sort of a whole process that we just don't have time for to get into to how those are developed. But hopefully more guidance will come if and when a final rule is issued on this. There are limited exceptions to applicability of the rule. Alaska Native corporations are accepted, as are nonprofits, higher education institutions, state and local governments, and then certain management and operating contractors. One note is that if you are a small business contractor as governed by the SBA regulations and you exceed the threshold for being a significant or major contractor, you have to comply with Scope 1 and Scope 2, but you're not required to comply with Scope 3, which is the annual climate disclosure of and the science-based target initiative that you'd otherwise have to comply with. Last, the requirement does apply to commercial off-the-shelf items as well, or commercial off-the-shelf contractors and commercial products and services. The inventories, so we talked about there's different scopes, Scope 1, 2, and 3. I'll just kind of briefly run through these. Scope 1 emissions are direct greenhouse gas emissions or emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by a contractor. So an example would include emissions from combustion in a contractor-owned or contractor-controlled boiler, furnace, or a vehicle, something like that. A Scope 2 emission is an indirect emission, or one that's associated with the generation of purchased electricity, heating and cooling when it's acquired for the contractor's own consumption. And so both Scope 1 and Scope 2, both categories of contractors, significant and major, have to inventory their greenhouse gas emissions within both of those categories. And then, as we said, for Scope 3, this applies to major contractors, and they have to inventory these emissions for other direct greenhouse gas emissions, which are considered emissions that are a consequence of that major contractor's operations, but occur at sources other than those owned by or controlled by that major contractor. So lots to unpack here, which we don't have time for. It's still a proposed rule. They received a lot of comments. Likely it's going to be challenged in the courts once the rule is issued, similar to the COVID mandate. You've already seen some opposition from Congress to the proposed rule. And of course, contractors are looking at this as far as how much time and resources the greenhouse gas inventories are going to take. And they're concerned with non-compliance because that, of course, could impact responsibility determinations necessary for receiving future contract awards. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just briefly mention this. This was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in 2021. It just asked for feedback regarding how GHG emissions could best be qualitatively and quantitatively considered in procurement decisions, including the social cost of those greenhouse gas emissions, which is really the big takeaway. And then if you go to the next slide, the Biden administration picked up on that and directed agencies to then consider the social cost of GHG emissions in their federal procurement decisions. So we'll see what becomes of that advance notice of proposed rulemaking. The next step would be a proposed rule and then a notice and comment period. If you go to the next slide. So we've been talking about what's proposed. Let's talk about what was actually implemented as a final rule. So what is now binding regulation? And this was recently in 2024. Part 23 of the FAR was reorganized and updated to require all federal agencies to procure sustainable products and services to the max extent practicable. The rule defines sustainable products and services as those that are subject to certain purchasing programs, and those are all sort of enumerated within the rule itself. The SNAP program, Energy Star, WaterSense, if BioPreferred, if you've ever heard of those are all considered subject to EPA purchasing programs. Thus, if an agency needs a product or service that's subject to one of those either statutory or EPA purchasing programs identified in the rule, the agency is required to procure to the max extent practicable a product or service that meets the requirements of those programs. Notably for contractors, there's a contract clause that will govern the sustainable products and services, and that would be binding on you as a contractor if you get award of a contract. It requires you to deliver or furnish sustainable products and services, incorporate them into public buildings or public works, and then of course furnish those products for use in performing the services under the contract. So whichever category you fall into. There are sort of these practicability considerations. The government might go out and say it's not practicable to procure sustainable products in this instance, and that they're going to look at things like performance schedule, the performance requirements, the reasonableness of the price, of course, is always going to be a factor. And there's certain exceptions and exemptions to this final rule, such as weapons systems, energy consuming products for combat, and for contracts that are performed outside of the United States. And so with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Amina. Oh, sorry, one more. Just a side note, the DoD, as usually what happens when the FAR issues a rule like this, the DoD has their own agency supplement, which also addresses sustainable procurement. The DoD essentially revised their DFARS supplement to align with the rule that we just looked at in Part 23.
Thanks, Teddy. Hi, everyone. We're going to sort of switch gears a little bit and sort of step back to contextualize the FAR rules in the broader ESG landscape. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So we really have the three actors that are shaping ESG-focused behaviors. And Teddy's really walked through, you know, from the government's whole of government approach, the Biden administration, you know, they've not only what Teddy's really walked through is the government as the buyer of services and products. So, and on that front, you know, it's demonstrated through the FAR rules because the federal government has established a sustainability plan, much like private companies have. And so they're essentially walking the walk. So that's one role that the government plays. But panning back to the broader landscape, whether it be international, federal, or state level, we're seeing governments adopt regulations either disclosure-focused and or diligence-focused. And they may also across the landscape of ESG, which is covering environmental, social, and governance. Or they're very focused on a subject like California's climate accountability law. So Gina will touch on a few others that where government has sort of advanced the focus on the private sector's primarily role with respect to environmental, social, and governance. So the private sector, you know, through its business practices and relationships with business partners, and particularly in the supply chain, also play a role on ESG. And on that point, the space is really fundamentally about accountability and transparency on business practices and impacts. They're often described as non-financial aspects because it's how the environment or social issues can influence the resiliency and long-term value of a company. You know, how is it impacting your business model and how resilient is your business model? We tend to see public companies feel the pressure most, but ESG is not confined to the public company space. You know, public companies have certainly put voluntary reports out, kind of talking about the impacts on their business and how they're evolving to meet the challenges of climate events, you know, as well as social issues. So but because of the supply chain, it's also very much reshaping private companies, or private companies on their own are seeing that there could be a competitive advantage. So each company sort of needs to look at where they sit in the broader ecosystem to understand what is their relationship with ESG and what is their relationship with their supply chain. And then we have the public sector, you know, they're really, or other stakeholders, it's sort of a catch-all group because they're really there to hold companies accountable, whether it's through buying practices, we're seeing it in litigation, we're also seeing it through shareholder activism. And this relationship has been incredibly dynamic for companies. navigating the pressure points and having companies really move either from a sort of flowing between a reactive posture to a proactive posture, which is the one we often try to get companies to sort of rethink about ESG. And also from a strategic to a compliance mindset. But now we're moving into a regulated environment. So I think, Gina, could you share how we think about ESG and sustainability broader?
Yes, please. Next slide. So when we're talking about ESG and sustainability, we often get the question, well, what do they mean? We're going to give you some information to help you along with that, but we're here to tell you that it's ever changing, and both terms, in fact, may have multiple meanings. So when we're talking about ESG in its traditional sense, we're really talking about how a business perceives its purpose, it generates profits, it creates resiliency, what its whole plan is for people and planet, and its impact on people and planet as a whole. And the reason why that term changes is because it's industry and company specific, depending on what your purpose is as a business and where you fit within the value chain and the supply chain and your impact on both the environment and social issues. Making it even more difficult, as I'm sure our listeners have all heard, is there's a lot of pushback on ESG with anti-ESG. So ESG is not going away, not just because we're seeing these pressures within the global economy. It is truly an issue about whether or not a profit is driven by your impact. So companies are saying, well, how am I going to refer to ESG that doesn't trigger an anti-ESG? Or the ESG industry and consultants are analyzing that. And so a word that's used in lieu of ESG is sustainability. So sustainability could mean the whole ESG bucket, or it could mean closer to what we're seeing here in the FAR and other regulations, which is it's really environmentally focused, and it's focusing on that impact on planet. So as we're talking about all of these different forces, let's kind of look at them on the next slide. ESG has been around for a long time. It really truly came into focus in 2020 for a number of reasons, including COVID's effect on supply chain, which is most important with today's presentation, but also the rise in different investor perspectives on driving profit through impact and changing social norms. At the same time, we had European and other foreign countries really raising the bar on compliance. As Teddy points out in the beginning, a number of the executive orders were to, for example, state the United States agreement with the Paris Climate Accords, which has most recently resulted in EU regulation regarding certain reporting, diligence, and accounting in the EU CSRD and DDD related to the environment and social issues. We've also seen California get on board, and they've finally funded and renamed their bills on reporting on greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks. So you see here on this slide all of these differing factors that are pushing ESG or sustainability are not just regulatory, but truly as the regulatory world comes to join the private sector norms and other factors, we're going to see a requirement here in your space, and we suspect that throughout the supply chain, and as we can already see, the FAR is starting to get in line with what's happening throughout the globe. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty easy when you look at that slide. It can be quite overwhelming because you just have regulation after regulation fitting into some element of ESG. And so often what we will talk about is looking at ESG as that framework and sort of breaking it, because when ESG is talked about, it's talked about very monolithically, like it's one thing, and it's not. It's very much the framework that we had on the prior slide. So, and it's often also broken down into verticals. So people will talk about the E or they'll talk about the S. But when you focus on that one vertical, you kind of miss the point because a lot of things are interconnected. So to put all of these in place and while there is the need to sit and go through to see which entity, what laws are you subject to, I think to be effective, we always think about governance at the top. So we offer that frame to you with the ESG space. It allows governance not only to be about structure, but also the opportunity to manage cultural risk, reputational risk, and also factor into strategy. And the far as prescriptive as it may seem, it will need to be kind of looked at into that broader landscape of the company's ESG strategy, to the extent there is one, frankly. There is a heightened expectation that ESG, so matters of climate in particular, get raised at the board level and have management oversight. So again, as you look at culture or you look at what is rising to the board level, the FAR can kind of be one extra piece of the puzzle in that organization. And so stepping back to look at strategy from a strategic level sort of allows you to sort of see where the FAR kind of comes into play. So next slide, please. So when we think about a strategy, you know, we talk about ESG being kind of an overlay to your business model. So how is it that you're making money? Who are your customers? Government's a customer here. You know, who are your other customers? And, you know, who are your suppliers? And that starts to, when you take that framework slide of topics and then you see what's sort of material to you, you kind of need to go through your components. So if the government is a major customer of yours, then that is going to raise climate into a relevant topic, and it will raise it into your ESG strategy and will likely raise it up to the board level. So that's one thing we offer here. It's to get to an ESG strategy, you really need to look at what is material to your stakeholders. So next slide, please. And that's where the supply chain has a particular role in ESG, because when you're talking about issues, social issues, you're talking about environmental issues. If one organization sets a strategy, whether it's a net zero strategy or it's a net positive strategy, or they want to reduce their GHG emissions, which, you know, any company, if you're, you know, likely you could be subject to any law, and you're very well likely going down the path of emissions tracking. You're very likely looking at or responding to requests of your suppliers, or having to start looking at your supply chain to see where those risks are, and not only risks, but those opportunities to meet your goals. And so the supply chain has a critical role in an ESG strategy from that perspective. And then I will turn it back over to Teddy.
Yeah, so I'll try and wrap up here with some sort of what can we prognosticate over the regulatory landscape. You know, as far as what is on the books as a final rule, we've got the agency's directive to procure to the maximum extent practicable sustainable products and services. So I think you could see a number of things. You could see pre-award disputes in the form of bid protests, where, you know, the agency has decided it is practicable or it is not to procure a sustainable product in some instance, and that turns on their acquisition planning, their market research, and you may see bid protests challenging the outcome of their decision as to whether they do or don't procure those. You could see these disputes arise post-award. Contractors and agencies could disagree as to whether the contractor is in fact providing products and services that meet the applicable purchasing program requirements. Disputes about whether contractors prioritize the different categories of those products per the new contract clause. And you could also see this dovetail with domestic sourcing requirements such as Buy American Act and the Berry Amendment, and sort of how they're balancing their supply chains and the requirements to meet both rules. On the greenhouse gas, you know, we're years off from that happening. Doesn't mean you shouldn't start thinking about this. And in some instances, it may make sense for a business to undertake efforts to reduce its greenhouse gas emission to get more favorable consideration by the government in a competitive procurement, even where not required to do so. You might see protest risk on the way the agencies evaluate disclosures of your 1, 2, and 3 emissions, if and when we get to that the final rule passage. You also have, you know, potential False Claims Act risk out there, which if you're going and you're calculating your GHG emissions, your scope 1, 2, and 3, and you're making a representation to the government, to the extent you're reckless in doing that, or those are false in some way, you could see that blowback. I'll end here with sort of the downstream effect of this. You know, there's no subcontract flow down requirement for the requirement to procure sustainable products and services. And that's because the primes are on the hook for procuring that. So you don't need to flow down to your subs, but it probably is a good idea, because otherwise you're on the hook for doing diligence of your supply chain and auditing your supply chain to know where those products are coming from and do they meet the relevant requirements and definitions that you, the prime, are bound by if you are sitting in the prime seat. And so, you know, it may make sense to revisit your commercial practices as well if you're going to make this change. For government work, a lot of times, you know, you want to make it just at the enterprise level and make it applicable to both commercial and non-commercial work.
Teddy, if I might.
That is all
Yeah,
the
Teddy,
time.
I know we're
Yeah, go
tight
ahead,
on
Kate.
time, but if I might add to that, your subs may be already required to comply with either the California greenhouse gas emissions, some of the rules that are sitting nationally, even though the SEC has not fully adopted its climate rule, or internationally, or your company already may be reporting internationally. All that said is you might be asked in supplier questionnaires as you're talking with your subs for you to verify this information, even though the FAR doesn't, certain information on climate impacts, even if it's beyond what the FAR requires. So you're going to see that within your business practices very soon as the California requirements take effect in 2026 and in other locations. And what we suggest is, you know, tie back to the broader ESG and purpose approach for your organization. Make sure you're aligned, so top down, and then make sure that, for example, your procurement teams are trained up in this area so that everybody's in alignment. And with that, we can go to the QR code. Your QR code is.
Go ahead, you read it.
QR code is on your screen. Use this for your CLE credit. And if you're just calling in, the attendance verification code is SS4721. And we thank you for coming today. And Teddy, thank you for having me and Amina on your series. We appreciate it.
Thank you all.